This has been another very interesting session. Thanks for all your work, and thank you for putting the effort into thinking around this. Again, there'll be lots of opportunity. I know you already have lots of opportunities in the public domain, but we may look for further opportunities for the university. So thank you very much for doing that, both Gareth and Esmond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
So we're now going to move on to our fourth and final session, which relates to the issues of young people, and youth and community work community youth work has always been a very strong area. We've recently set up a research centre in this, and so one of the themes that we thought we would address today, because it has come up so often, is some of the ways in which we can track the impact on young people. So the way this one's going to run is as three separate contributions from three different parts of the university network. The first one is from Dr. Gail Neill, and Gail is a lecturer in the Community Youth Work programme. She's the programme director for the Fast Track within that, and previously she has a long history as an actual youth worker in the field, and that is very much her interest is between the field and the research and teaching space. So we look forward to hearing what Gail has to say, and then after that there'll be an opportunity again for questions. Again, I apologise if I've overlooked your question.
Good afternoon and welcome along to COVID and the Aftermath, a series of papers and discussions that help us to articulate learning from the last year and consider the way forward. My name is Gail Neill, and along with colleagues Liz McArdle and Breda Friel from the Centre for Youth Research and Dialogue here at Ulster University, we present three short summary papers on the impact of COVID on young people, lessons that have been learned and possible responses going forward. I'll present the first of three papers, Findings from the COVID Under-19 Global Study. This was conducted by the Centre for Children's Rights at Queen's in partnership with a range of global NGOs and partners. Over 26,000 children and young people from 137 countries across the 5 UN nations responded to this survey, sharing their experiences of COVID and the impact that it had had on them. Liz McArdle will then share more local findings from Youth Pact, the Young Voice Project 2020 in 4. This was a participatory, interactive initiative that enabled young people to share words and emotions that summarised their experiences of 2020. Finally, Breda Friel will conclude by sharing some insights from her research and practice on crisis and trauma recovery, and how the application of strengths-based approaches and post-traumatic growth theory might offer a way forward for community recovery. Each paper will be about 10 minutes with time for Q&A at the end of each. Obviously, in the 10-minute window, we'll only have the opportunity to highlight some headline findings as a means of generating discussion, but links to the full resources and studies will be provided at the end of our input. COVID Under-19 is a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together children, civil society organisations, academia and other partners to work in understanding children and young people's experiences of their rights during the COVID-19 pandemic. A goal of the initiative was to create a space for children across the globe to be meaningfully involved in discussions around issues triggered by the pandemic and to contribute towards shaping a post-COVID-19 world. In May 2020, a global consultation survey was launched that sought to capture the experiences of children and young people, but also to apply a rights-based approach that involved children and young people as research advisors from the outset. The survey was open for 2 months, during which time over 26,000 children and young people from 137 countries responded. To date, 9 briefing papers have been published by the Centre for Children's Rights at Queen's. These include education, poverty, experiences of COVID, family life, participation, play, representations of children and young people, safety and violence, and a headlines paper. There are also a series of briefings currently under review by children and young people on the experiences of specific groups of young people, for example, LGBT young people with disabilities, and young people with care experience. Many children and young people reported that they were unaffected during the pandemic, or some even noted that they had a better experience during this time. Many young people reported that it was a positive experience for them because they had more time to spend with their family, that their parents were at home more often, that education also was different and at a different pace, and that they had more free time to pursue hobbies and interests. Other young people also noted the positive benefits of lockdowns and restrictions meant that there were environmental benefits. One young girl from Costa Rica says, "We're letting the planet breathe again." And a young boy from the Philippines noted, "The environment can at last rest from pollution." There were, of course, many negative experiences shared by young people with regards to the impact that the pandemic had had on their lives. Many children noting that they missed school, they missed meeting with their friends and members of their extended family. And for others, they noted the significant impact that this had on their mental health. Children also spoke about missing the physical closeness of being able to hug their friends and family, about missing out on key milestones such as birthdays and graduations. Article 28 and 29 of the UNCRC, Education. 12% of children said their education was better during coronavirus. Some children noted that it was that they were able to learn at their own pace, or that they were able to pursue their own interests due to free time that they had, while others felt it was better because they didn't have to physically go to school. Most children, however, over half of the 13 to 17-year-olds said that education was better before. Children with no access to the internet or with poor internet access were also much more likely to say that education was better before the pandemic. Article 27, Adequate Standard of Living. Across the survey responses from children and young people, there was reference made to the negative economic impact of the pandemic, both on society and on their individual families. They expressed concern that parents did not have enough money to fulfill basic needs, especially where parents or family members became unemployed. 41% said their family had less money to meet needs since the pandemic. The situation was worse for some groups. A majority of migrant children, 58%, and asylum-seeking children, 56%, said their family had less money to meet their needs. Almost half of the children with disabilities said their families had less money. Article 19, Protection from Violence. Many children reported feeling safer than, or as safe as, they had done before the pandemic. Younger children, those aged 8 to 10, were the age group most likely to report feeling more safe at home. Some of those reported feeling safer as a result of being indoors. They felt this was the safest place to be during a pandemic. For others, being at home meant that they were less exposed to the violence within their communities or within their schools. This was not the case for all children and young people. The survey results demonstrate that some children and young people are at increased risks of violence as a result of the pandemic. As you can see in the PowerPoint here, some of those groups to experience higher levels of violence than others. 22% of children and young people from migrant communities, 20% of those living in detention centres, refugee camps or homeless centres, 20% of children seeking asylum, 19% of children and young people who identify as LGBTQI, and 14% of children with disabilities said that they had heard, witnessed or experienced more violence now than before the pandemic. And finally, Article 2, Discrimination and Public Attitudes to Children and Families. 16% of children and young people felt that they were portrayed more negatively in the media now than prior to the pandemic. Older children, those 13 to 17, were more likely than younger children to feel that this portrayal had gotten worse. Of interest, children in the UK and Ireland were more likely to feel this portrayal had gotten worse since the pandemic compared to children from other countries. Continuing with public attitudes, many young people felt that the government and the public more generally failed to see the contribution that they had made to stop the spread during the pandemic. Many young people reported that they missed out on meeting with friends and family as a means of stopping the spread, that they'd missed out on other traditional milestones such as proms and graduations, that they had been denied many of the typical youth experiences, the transitions between school, of leaving school, of going to university. Young people noted the many sacrifices they felt that they had made as a means of reducing the impact of the pandemic. As noted, this is just a very quick overview of some of the headline findings from a couple of these briefings. All 9 briefings are available on either the Centre for Children's Rights website at Queen's or the Critical Voice NI website. There are also further analysis from the study forthcoming. I look forward to your questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail. And thank you for that very comprehensive but difficult overview of just all the issues that are there. Just to remind people, and I say this with hesitation a little bit now, that please put your questions in and I will try to put them in. What we have decided is that all the questions that have been in the chat will be put to the relevant presenters later on anyway, to allow people to respond if we haven't got time to get to them. Gail, from the preliminary findings, are there particular groups, minority groups potentially, disability groups, LGBTI groups, for example, who have reporting more difficulties, or are there particular impacts that we should think about in more, I suppose, more differentiated ways, not to think about just young people, but certain kinds of young people?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's great. It's been a fantastic day. And I think some of the questions here relate to some of the inputs that we've had previously. So comments from the like of Siobhan and Gareth, who said, not everybody experienced this the same. And we can see that within the COVID under 19 study, where not all young people have the same experiences of this, and some will experience it in more profound ways than others. And actually those probably who are most likely to have their rights breached anyway will feel that in a disproportionate way. And some of the briefing papers that are currently under review with groups of young people are looking specifically at those minority groups. So the briefing that I'm involved in write-up is around LGBTQI young people, and like I say, there's other briefings available around disability as well. So with regards to the LGBTQI, which I was personally involved in, there was almost 1,000 young people involved in the study who identified as LGBT. And within that subsample, there were higher levels of violence reported amongst that population than the general population. And also amongst this population, there were higher recordings of those who noted feeling less safe at home during the pandemic. And an interesting statistic to come through was that 42% of the LGBTQI population reported feeling lonely, compared to 24% of the general sample. So definitely worth looking at this through a number of kind of minority lenses, and that's the stage that the study's currently at. So at each aspect, the findings were brought back to a young person's advisory group, and they're currently reviewing the specific groups around disability, care, LGBT, and asylum seeking young people.
This kind of a question to you as a youth work researcher and previously a practitioner, probably still in some degree. The young people and the experience of young people has been highlighted by several of our presenters as a kind of particular area of concern, but also an area where the impacts have been measurably some of the strongest mental health issues, also the economy and so on. Do you think, and this is not just a kind of a politically correct question, but there would be a value in a way for young people to feed directly into policy thinking as we come out of COVID? And what would that look like? Just simply, or who can speak on behalf of young people at this time, given that they are the people who are likely to experience the long dimensions for longest?
Yeah, great question, Duncan. Again, as part of this study, what I think makes it particularly interesting is the children's rights element to it. Within Article 3 of the UNCRC, it notes that the best interests of the child should be primary consideration. And many of the children that we spoke to, only 20% felt that the government listened to them. So the majority felt that their voices weren't heard or reflected. And I think what's significant about this study was taking a child's rights approach meant that it really focused on kind of this Lundy model of participation. And I think what we do, we have traditionally done okay, or we've done fairly well with, is about space and voice, two elements of the Lundy model of participation, which is providing a space for young people to share their views and opinions. And voice is about ensuring that they have the adequate information to form a view and opinion. So I think sometimes we're quite good at that in terms of creating space for young people, providing them with the information to have an opinion and to share that opinion. Now, the two other elements to the Lundy model of participation is around audience and influence. And I think these are the areas that perhaps we aren't so good at following up at or taking seriously. And the audience influence elements of this model of participation focus on who hears this information that has the power and the influence to make a difference. And are we making sure that those messages go through? So rather than just collecting all of these views and opinions from young people, who gets access to that and who hears that? So as part of this study, young people were asked to give their messages to government. And again, there's a huge partnership approach within this study that looked to engage NGOs, academia, civil society to ensure that we don't just collect information, but that we ensure that the right audience with the right influence have the opportunity to hear these messages also.
Are you, as a result of your research, do you come away, if you like, more concerned about some of the challenges for young people, or do you come away almost impressed by the resilience of young people? I suppose it's this balance that's in your own research. Different people have experienced this, as you say, differently. There it's very hard to make absolute judgment. Mm-hmm. But do you think that for most young people this is a question of resilience, or do you think there are specific things that we do actually now need to take seriously because they're likely to affect us as we go forward?
Yeah. I think children and young people are doing incredibly well during all of this, given, that, a lot of the times they weren't the first people getting this information. They weren't being communicated with on their level, and that often the fear of their parents, the concerns of their schools, the narrative of politicians filtered down, and they made sense of that in their own way as well. And when we talk to young people, they were nervous and they were scared, and it wasn't necessarily about their own health, but that they translated and consumed the messages that they heard at a wider level in terms of what this meant. This idea that somehow they were little vectors running around, that potentially you could kill your granny, and so lots of that, trying to process that information, and children and young people have done fantastically well. And again, lots of the forums that adults have to continue to communicate with friends, to have that engagement, while it was lessened during this last year and a half, for a lot of young people, depending on their age, that was cut off entirely. So in terms of even just that social support and those networks were really limited. And I think as well, just some of the demonisation of young people as well over this last year and a half, hasn't been great for them either. That idea of, where's your children tonight? That idea that just the visibility of children and young people on the street becomes a problem. So I think young people have done a fantastic job over this last year of keeping going and kind of bouncing off some of the negativity that's come their way. But absolutely, we need to invest in young people going forward. And I think, a lot of the focus initially has been on formal education, trying to get young people caught up. But I think there's lots of other things that we need to invest in children and young people around, and again, some of the other presentations have spoken to that in terms of all of the other things that they've missed out on over this last year and a half, in terms of how do we create those safe spaces, how do young people play, how do we get young people, out into different environments, and all of the things that informal and non-formal education has traditionally brought young people, and the value of that. We need to ensure that we invest in that as much as we're concerned with the formal side of education as well.
Listen, Gail, thank you very much indeed. Again, this is never enough, but we're moving on now to the next bit. But thank you very much for your presentation and that chance to have a chat about it. So that was great. Thank you very much indeed. We're moving on to Gail's colleague, Liz McArdle. Liz is also a lecturer in youth work in Ulster University. She's the course director for the Certificate in Youth Studies, and she's a project manager for Youth Pact, which is a training and support package under the Peace 4 programme for children and young people. She also has a long history of work in equality work on young people, particularly with Youth Action, and she has recently developed the Life Maps positive mental health model with her colleague Simon Ward. So we now can hear from Liz, as I say, questions put into the chat, and then we'll have a chance to talk to Liz after the presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Liz McArdle. I am the project manager for the Youth Pact project, as well as lecturer in Jordanstown. But I want to speak to you about a couple of pieces of work from the Youth Pact project. Youth Pact is a Peace 4 funded programme that provides support and training for youth workers that are delivering peace programmes with young people. It's a 4-piece partnership of Cooperation Ireland, the National Youth Council of Ireland, Pobble and Ulster University. The 2 pieces of work I want to speak to you about have been carried out by Youth Pact. And these are Young Voices 2020 in 4, carried out by Joe Hawkins from the National Youth Council of Ireland, and At the Threshold, Youth Work During the COVID-19 Pandemic, carried out by Leanne McConville and myself through Youth Pact. So first to 2020 in 4. The Young Voices project was carried out by Joe Hawkins. The purpose of this was to work with these Peace 4 projects to help their young people to make sense of their pandemic experience. It was called 2020 in 4, for young people to create something that was 4 words, 4 lines, 4 verses, 4 images, or 4 sounds that described their experience of 2020. There were about 40 different submissions from over 90 young people across the Peace for Youth projects. And these have been curated by Joe Hawkins and Joanne Stainsby into a gallery of voices in front of you here using the Padlet with a series of images, videos, etc. The link is in the chat for you now. I want to give you a snapshot of some of the contributions from young people to give you a flavour of their lives during this period. One young participant from the Breakthrough Project submitted this. This makes a powerful statement for the year. Sad, scared, chilled, and down at the bottom corner, wasted time and me. Many of these materials, however, illustrate the human capacity for cognitive dissonance, whereby young people, like many adults, could hold what are seemingly conflicting feelings at the same time. So over on the right, we see happy, isolated, grateful, and angry. The very extreme emotions that were expressed were also as a result of being bombarded with public health messages. So trying to make sense of a rapidly changing situation for this young person was scary and draining, unexpected and tough. For another young man, it is clear that COVID has compounded any pre-existing issues, with those who are already disadvantaged being disproportionately affected. This young participant shows his emojis of anger, drinking and depression. He ends with a heart as him and his partner are expecting a new baby. He says, so then I would go on the drink and get myself into a bad debt for the next few weeks. That made me feel really depressed and angry at myself. So you hear the alcohol, the money worries heaped on top of self-loathing, anger and depression. Or this story of COVID from this young woman from Ballymena in the Amplify project. Again, issues that have been aggravated through lockdowns and isolations. And I'll read you a wee bit of her story. When I heard about COVID-19 and schools were closing, I was happy, thinking I was getting an early holiday. And then a few weeks or days into lockdown, I realised I was completely wrong. I felt lost. I wasn't myself. I locked myself in my room, watched Netflix and tried to hide how I felt about the situation. The easiest option was to stay in my room or go on a long walk. I felt like my family were so disappointed because of my feelings. During quarantine, my mental health went down suddenly. It was worse as I had no one to talk to face to face. School had a big impact on me. I missed my education and now I've started back to school with so much anxiety. I hurt to live like this. You will hear more from Breda Friel about resilience throughout this period. And we also saw this through 2020 in 4. Over and over again, young people added one positive word to illustrate their experiences. And these might seem a little incongruous when put side by side with the other very intense emotions that were being described. So this one is from the Amplify project with a young participant in Donegal: virus, hope, disappoint, lonely. Or this one from Strive in the Northwest: isolated, panic, gratitude and bonding. What stands out, however, is that each of the experiences, while sharing similar characteristics with their peers, is different, individual and personal to them. So this young man from the Strive project found that the online space was actually more manageable for him than being part of a face-to-face group. The words chosen are very optimistic words: eventful, positive, creative, introverted. All of the young people involved in 2020 in 4 were taking part in Peace 4 funded programs with youth workers. And this work continued throughout the pandemic, moving from face-to-face work to online programs. So in some cases, the young people used the letters of their project to describe how the workers in these projects kept them going during this period. So on the left, we have the Breakthrough project with reference to the building of bonds between group members, anxiety, Kahoots quizzes, walks up the Cave Hill, online learning, and finally, H for happiness. And then on the right, Define project from Springboard with I for independence, isolation, icebreakers, and inviting, being a reference to the staff of the project. And also a reference to the programs being not long enough and a reference to lockdowns not allowed out. There's a lot more in 2020 and 4 that you can peruse if you follow that link. The second piece of work I want to reference is At the Threshold, youth work during the COVID pandemic. And this charts how youth work and youth workers responded to the emerging needs of the young people in their projects. 43 youth work practitioners took part in the research, and the programs that they were running with young people are long-term programs, about 6 to 8 months, running group work 2 or 3 days per week. So when the first lockdown hit, they changed their offerings quickly to meet practical support needs and to work out ways that they could combat the isolation and keep the young people motivated to learn. So this infographic gives you an idea of some of the activities that youth workers took on. Youth workers delivered food parcels, care packages, hard copy learning materials and resources. They distributed dongles to those who had no broadband. Some projects bought data for young people to keep them online. They delivered Easter eggs to show care. They posted disco balls to some group participants so that they could have an online disco. They pivoted quickly to the online Zoom delivery, developing scavenger hunts, bingo, group tasks, cookery sessions, TikTok challenges. Some young people didn't like the Zoom experience, so they might have taken part in a gaming group online with the worker, or took phone calls and WhatsApp messages for one-to-one support. So what we heard in the research was of the adaptability and the creativity of the youth workforce during this time to respond to swiftly changing needs. Of itself, these practical supports might not be the majority of a youth worker's role or repertoire, but what it did in these instances was illustrate the commitment of the youth worker to take care of the young person. I'm going to highlight three main points that came out of the research. Youth workers were taking on a welfare role, offering young people a digital lifeline. And their welfare role was trying to ensure the safety and security of the young people in the first instance, and to hold connection to the young people at a time when they could easily drift away. So the research records the real connections that were made and the transformational work that can happen in that online space. This online space has been a real transformation for some young people. There was one young woman who would not speak in the group before lockdown. Now she is speaking and leading conversations. We're now using one-to-one work to explore how we can take those skills into the real world. Creating a safe enough space, there was a strong ethical issue to be considered quickly when lockdowns began about being in a young person's personal space and family home. And while a youth worker's role is to create a safe space for growth to happen, the task now was to create a safe enough space. Now that was pretty difficult for some of the young people in the project who might have had no devices or shared devices in a house and no room that was private for them to join their groups. One worker stated, however, the times whenever it was happening, you know, there was family members that were right beside them on a Zoom call, maybe under the influence of alcohol. So in some ways, it wasn't just young people coming on to an online session. It was other people in the family. At home, some young people are holding back, maybe because there's somebody in the background. Engagement and disengagement. Through all of this, these were the key. Workers were trying to cajole young people to stick with them and trying to motivate them to engage without adding any further pressure to them. So a careful balance was needed here. This is where the real creativity was needed, to have online activities and offerings that are attractive enough for young people to want to return over and over again. So using games like Human Olympics were good for creating the buzz around the group. I think that worked really, really well. At 2 p.m, some of the young people maybe weren't out of bed, so the workers would start by giving them a task to start their day by going outside, take a photograph of something outside, and then upload it onto Twitter or WhatsApp. The main tool for engagement is the strength of the relationship between the young person and the youth worker. They did not stay with the project necessarily for its activities. They stayed to be with their peers and the worker. The primacy of that relationship was the key action used to combat the isolation. Young people have seen the value of the work. Through the lockdown, we were there for them. These are just a few of the insights gained through the research. I want to finish off by offering 5 takeaway thoughts for you. First, young people were significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic through loss of connection, isolation, disrupted relationships, disrupted education, lost opportunities. However, youth work came in to help mitigate that impact by being there with young people, maintaining relationships and hope. This crisis period also demonstrated the role that youth work can play within a multidisciplinary approach and across a range of mental health, educational, recreation, and social policy priorities set by government. And this period and the youth work response illustrated the need for tailored responses and significant investment in youth work as we prepare to face the long-term issues for and with young people. But ultimately, we're struck by the levels of resilience shown by young people, how they drew on their own sense of self-efficacy to sustain themselves through the pandemic. I want to thank you for listening, and we'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Liz. Again, another really interesting presentation. So the questions again. Any questions? Hi, Liz.
Hi, Duncan.
So, I suppose there are a number of issues to rise out of that. We've heard over the whole day and in your own stuff about the potential that, you know, unequal experiences will compound the problems. I think you talked about things which compound and extend the problem. And I think Siobhan earlier talked about alcohol. We heard about unemployment and the potential risks there. What for you are the things that you're most focused on, that you think are the things we need to have at the centre of our concern at this point?
Well, I suppose what you have are both structural issues and maybe individual and community-based issues. So in terms of structural issues, you would have heard Siobhan earlier on saying the common denominator as poverty is really the starting point. And what we saw were those who started off with less ending up with even less, and connected to that were issues of digital poverty and or having space and no space. So either connectivity or having physical space whereby people were able to engage with services outside of the home. So those that were isolated became more isolated. So on the one hand, we have sort of a lot of those sort of structural issues related to poverty, space, families that were living in increasingly squeezed and pressurized times, and then young people at the bottom of the heap in that. And then I suppose in terms of individual young people or groups of young people, you had then that networks were really squeezed and young people being very isolated, not having the usual kind of fleeting moments with other young people that you have in those social spaces. You also had this sense of young people being expected to be motivated, but with not the usual, you know, factors that might help in that motivation. And then also the sense of continuously having to be under the microscope. So suddenly young people that maybe in school might have had little spaces where people weren't watching, or at home people weren't watching, suddenly everybody's all in the one space. So you had this sense of living under a microscope in different ways. So I think certainly for us that there was, the youth workers would have worked very quickly to try and address issues of access to resources, access to mental health resources, signposting young people towards services that they needed very quickly, trying to provide quick practical supports for young people, but fundamentally the poverty and low-lying issues related to that are the ones that are probably going to persist the longest, Duncan, that youth work will have to live with, as we have done for some time.
There's a question in the chat about the kind of service that has to be supported, you know, especially in the area of digitalization and how, I suppose it says, is there a need? But I'll rephrase it, which is not right. But how would you ensure a kind of a generous, dedicated support of youth work structures? Do you think that's something that should be prioritised now coming out of the pandemic? Do you think that now is, and where would your priorities be, I suppose?
I think that it became apparent that youth work was recognised within the Department of Education and the Education Authority as having a different role that was way more found easier connections to young people, and they were seen in some ways, some people were calling it an extra emergency service. I think that maybe is troublesome in other ways, but I think it illustrates that youth workers were bridging gaps in education and in welfare services that some of the other services weren't able to do, and that was to do with the flexibility and the adaptability of the approach that's used in youth work. In terms of services, I think that Gail mentioned that there's a lot of attention at the minute about catch-up school, catch-up education, talk about, you know, how schools are going to respond to the gap in that academic learning, whereas I think that that's really that might put more of a squeeze on young people, actually, whereas I think what youth work can do is relieve some of the pressure, and that even in where we have opportunities for either generic youth work or early intervention youth work services, which are working with young people that are at the early showing signs of just pressure, anxiety, but not necessarily what Siobhan's talking about, those acute services. There's lots of things that youth work can do that are not necessarily going to put pressure on the health sector, but can have a massive impact on how young people approach either that they fall off the edge or that they work out how to find your way back into some sort of normality.
You identified the flexibility of youth work and, you know, the changes that happened, and your research kind of tracks some of those changes in the responses in COVID. Did you do you think that those responses that were developed in COVID and as we come out of it are sustainable and should be sustained in terms of the digital stuff, for example? And then a second question, which is only a bit related, but it is related, is do you think that this multidisciplinary experience in youth work can be sustained? Because that certainly, I'm hearing you say, you know, that it was the integration of youth work into other services which made this particular value added. So I'm just interested, if that came out of COVID, is that now the something that we could kind of emphasize as we go forward?
I'll start with that second one, Duncan. The idea of I think the multidisciplinary approach and the role of youth work within that has opportunities only if youth work holds its principles and practices, and where youth workers are seen to be people who can develop relationships with young people, build up learning opportunities, and also walk with young people while also addressing some of the structural issues. That's the strength of what youth workers bring. If they try to be pseudo social workers, pseudo teachers, and if some of the other, you know, allied professions try and integrate youth workers into how they do business, then you lose the strength of the profession. So I think that's the strength is
as it holds its own discipline-specific principles and practices. In terms of the digital approaches, I think there needs to be a digital strategy for youth work and for young people. I think what we've seen are the digital world, you were able to reach into spaces where young people are isolated, and you can find connections, whether it was with gaming groups or whatever, and you have young people who respond in a digital world. Young men and young women respond differently to those digital interactions. So definitely there's opportunities there, but it would have to be a blended approach, because the face-to-face has the fleeting moments where you discover all sorts of things about people that you can't do in this space.
Great. Listen, Liz, thank you very much indeed. I see that Joe Hawkins has put into the chat the ARC paper, Reclaiming Youth Work, a return to the founding principles of youth work during the COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe that is, it's plus ça change, it's back to what matters in youth work. But anyway, thank you very much indeed for that part of the presentation. We're now going to move on to the final presentation today, and the final part of this presentation from Breda Friel rather. Gail Neill, sorry, Breda Friel. Breda wrote her doctoral work on suicide prevention policy in Ireland, and is working on autism spectrum and CYW and the importance of relationships in practice, and is currently researching museums, crisis, and the COVID-19. So Breda is central to the development of a new centre in youth work, which is developing all sorts of new ways to reach out and to connect practice with theory. And so we're delighted to have Breda along to complete the third of the three presentations in community youth work.
My name is Breda Friel. I'm a member of the Community Youth Work Department based at Ulster University, and I'm also a member of the Centre for Youth Research and Dialogue. I'm here to talk about the unfolding narrative from COVID-19, reflections, practice themes, and restorative recovery. COVID-19 and the associated lockdown measures of governments globally is a chronic crisis that has impacted all aspects of functioning at individual, community, and societal levels. The effect of the illness itself on citizens and their families, and the halt to normal ways of life, is likely to have long-lasting societal legacy. The narrative arising from the pandemic is constructing the knowledge base, informing the skills and themes for professionals across caring services as they meet individuals, groups, and communities through their practice. The centrality of youth services to community recovery is the theme in this presentation and our research, exploring and encouraging, looking at funding and indeed policy making in considering the practices of youth work in the context of community recovery post-COVID-19. The narrative from the pandemic is constructing the knowledge base, and I would argue that youth work projects and organisations can become central places for narrating, for commemorating the trauma of the disease's impact, as well as meeting potential healing and restorative needs of both individuals and communities, where such fundamentally important questions can be represented, interrogated, and reflected upon. The pandemic has instigated deep reflection on the nature of society and community. Communities, while sharing many values and beliefs, are not wholly homogeneous entities. People undeniably build a sense of community togetherness around such features as ethnicity or socio-economic status, or indeed a geographical place. But they may have very differing views and opinions on other aspects of their lives. During the pandemic, we have seen how the idea of community cohesiveness has come to be challenged because of the range of opposing responses that individual members have articulated. Differences on mask wearing, shielding, social distancing and freedoms have been major points of contestation and tension. These have often manifested as arguments between neighbours or the breakdown of friendships which have been the bedrock of a local community's sense of togetherness. Added to this has been the deep sense of grief and trauma for those who have lost loved ones or who have been ill with the disease COVID-19. Rippling like a pond, like a pebble in a pond, the pandemic affected many people in many, many ways. At a basic level, people had a need for comfort, for calming, with connecting to information, services, social and medical supports. Most fundamentally, individuals require confidence in setting down their experience in a held space, a development of self-support and an emotional self-soothing capacity which supports steps towards recovery. I consider the concept of therapeutic holding as creating a safe, structured listening space involving mental and emotional containment that respects, supports and validates people's experiences of crisis. I propose that this involves non-intrusive assessing of need and concerns with listening ear, therapeutic engagement and psychoeducation on recovery and crisis. A noteworthy and peculiar aspect of the particular crisis of COVID-19 as a pandemic is that it impacted with a sudden, unforeseen seriousness. Most people assuming it would be acute and short-term in duration. The sense of surreal of the impact created shock and surprise as the virus developed into a longer-term chronic stressor, overwhelming the coping mechanisms and capacity of all affected. This is how I define a crisis: any event or series of events that overwhelms the coping mechanisms of individuals and community. Given the unprecedented nature of COVID-19, the new virus confounded national and international medical experts, such as the World Health Organization. It confounded government experts. It is understandable then that citizens would experience a sense of the surreal and feel overwhelmed and a sense of crisis, because citizens were left feeling confused, unsettled, beleaguered, overcome, and at times devastated. The uncertainty and fear expressed by citizens became exacerbated as they witnessed and experienced the devastating effect of the virus and the varied responses of governments, the lack of preparedness, the unfolding knowledge, and the subsequent actions across institutions of state. There are varied debates in literature and research about crisis management and catastrophe management theory and about debriefing and models and management of critical events. These range from questions about the efficacy of critical incident stress debriefing, discussions about the effectiveness of the interventions, discussions about the management and delivery of approaches. Research publications can generally be categorized into those that are advocates of critical incident and crisis management theory, those that are critical of the methodologies, and personal narrative accounts of crisis and events. It's my assertion that the knowledge, skills, and methodologies from psychological first aid methods, from critical incident stress management protocols and crisis incident stress debriefing methods, can offer us guidelines in responding to COVID-19 across the community. Much can be derived from such models that offer a valuable part of the repertoire of skills and practices that can be applied to the understanding and managing the experiences of COVID-19 across multidisciplinary settings. And this is my assertion as part of the recovery and planning and policy making in community recovery for COVID-19. The value to counselling and allied health professions such as youth and social work of such models offers practitioners a theoretical and a skills-based foundation when engaging with the impact of COVID-19. Trauma is considered the impact of overwhelming information flow due to a critical event or series of events. Psychologically and physiologically, the thinking and body reactions respond to the perceived or real danger or threat to life. The human freeze, flee, faint, or fight reaction is activated. This alters the chemical level of adrenaline and cortisone in the body, thereby mobilizing the human into action. Bounded by our rationality, us humans need to make sense of the surreal and the nonsensical events that comprise a critical incident. And bounded by our rationality, us humans need to make sense of the surreal and nonsensical events that comprise the critical incident and crisis that is COVID-19. Time can appear to stand still or pass in a blur. The events happen suddenly, and thus they require organising and sequencing. As a methodology, critical incident debriefing offers a structured, focused opportunity of time-limited duration to set down, clarify and organise facts and thoughts, emotions and symptoms arising from the crisis. The process puts a structure to the timeline of what we have been experiencing and helps us to begin normalising the abnormal. And so therefore we commence recovery and we start to make sense. COVID-19 pandemic is a chronic long-term crisis event, the impact of which is unfolding as an emotional, as a physiological, as a psychological range of experiences and symptoms. This is our priority need across the community. Symptoms range from those who had minimal impact from the pandemic to those who have experienced significant impact due to loss, ill health, economic, social and family issues. The use of the repertoires that I am advocating today offers us opportunities in the development of policy and procedures for managing community recovery, for emergence and re-entry from the current crisis. Articulating the factors, the theories, the skills and the methods to assist can be considered in developing such responses and how they can be applied across a range of settings. Most significantly, we need opportunities for people to have their experiences validated. People's experiences have been validated to greater or lesser extent depending on whether they were hospitalized, not hospitalized, tested positive, tested negative, had long COVID, didn't have any symptoms from COVID, weren't tested at all. The range of experiences is vast And the impact of COVID is that it is not one size fits all, and everybody's experience is unique. All requires validation. I advocate that we can derive from research and from theory across a range of different models and practices that are listed here. And this is an important feature of us developing recovery across the community and programs across community and voluntary and statutory settings. Language, as Legg said in 1998, is the vehicle of our culture. It's the mechanism by which we constrain or are unhindered in talking about our experiences. In sharing and listening to others, people enter into a culture, and as a consequence, our thinking and our understanding are informed. Individual words and terminology become enriched and loaded with complex meaning. As we construct sentences and stories about our experiences, we begin to make sense. And the stories of people's lives are individual constructs of their life experiences, not actual reality, but their account and their narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The pandemic has resulted in the development of a new vocabulary, an emerging terminology for the classification and the description of the unfolding events from January 2020. Until word of a virus emerged in China, terms such as COVID-19, pandemic, lockdown, tiers, levels, long tail, antibodies, vaccines were unfamiliar, but have since been immersed into the repertoire of our collective everyday practice and usage. The language and nomenclature and the narrative of crisis events can be activated as we recall, we recount, or we witness and bear witness to the crisis that people have experienced. As the citizens' level of exposure to the tragedy, to the death, to the illness of COVID-19 increased, so too did the presentations and experiences of anxiety, stress, and depression. Practice with individuals who have experienced trauma or crisis requires careful and vigilant use of language, terms of reference, symptoms, and assessment. A case involving impact and death, where the client struggles to find words that are impossible to express the depth of loss, loneliness, fear, anger, fragility, heartbreak and hurt, and pain and grief that feels like a physical pain in the heart and chest. I am advocating that we be very mindful of the terminology that we are using to describe the presentations arising from COVID-19. I am advocating that we be careful about using terms such as tsunami of mental health issues. I am proposing the importance of a strength-based, finely tuned management of community recovery phases that are culturally and context sensitive. I am advocating the need for clear communication approaches in the nomenclature and language in the management and delivery of recovery program and planning. And I am advocating that the evidence and theory and practice from the fields of disaster management and crisis management practice offers the foundation for symptom mitigation measures and community recovery from COVID-19. I propose a shift across organisational management towards a workplace wellness approaches based on embedding resilience-based crisis incident stress management protocols and professional development across caring professions. thank you for attending and for listening to my presentation, and I am happy to take any questions or comments or open this presentation for discussion and consideration.
Thank you very much, Breda. And I think a very thoughtful and reflective way to finish the presentations for today. Just a couple of questions for you, I suppose, as we're thinking in response to what you said there. You talked a lot about crisis and what was overwhelming and so on, and that it was a chronic event and so on, and it was also a very comprehensive event. I suppose that one of the practical questions that arises out of this is, how can those kind of issues or be implemented across the services for programs for young people and communities? Where would you put the priority, I suppose, is the question there.
Yeah, I think some of that has already been addressed, and in my what I firmly think is an important feature is that the presence of some symptoms and some fallout and some impact of COVID-19 is not in itself a sign of illness and mental health illness. And what it is a response to the crisis and the stressors. And most importantly, I think what has been said already by Gail and by Liz, I would concur with, in the sense that, if we can, across the presentation or across the responses, both in terms of policy and planning, if we can actually recognise the importance of people having their experience validated, the setting down of what has happened, and the priority in terms of the policy actors having a priority around the multidisciplinary aspect of the response, and particularly from a strength-based approach. I think really embedding that across policy responses, education responses, youth work responses. And I also, and the very last bit was about workplace well-being. I think that, workers across youth services, across a range of services, have responded in an excellent way and in a fully with an immediacy. And we know from the research that the immediacy of a response mitigates the longer term impact, and so that immediacy and that responsiveness, both informal and formal, creates a kind of a holding site for people, and they feel therefore safe where before they felt very unsafe. So I think across a range of settings, we can implement programs and opportunities for people to recognize that it's human to have a reaction. Yeah. This kind of get up and get on with it is grand, it's good, and we all do that. However, it's okay to have felt the impact. We would expect people to be impacted, and it's the opportunity to have that impact, what I'm calling normalizing the abnormal.
Would you have a fear that if we don't acknowledge that kind of personal psychological dimension and that experience as a kind of holistic way that you're talking about, that there will be a long consequence? In other words, that it's actually quite important to put this up front now?
I think it's really important. I think it's really important that we manage, and you've heard it yourself, there's going to be a tsunami of mental health issues arising out of COVID. That, you hear this across social media, across the media. And yes, there are going to be symptoms. We're all feeling, the world all of a sudden, our ordinariness is gone, and the world is feeling a little bit unsafe. But it's about being able to put a structure around that and know that training people to feel safe, even though there is a perception of a lack of safety. So I think as much as we can do to reduce the impact, and the psychoeducation part really matters in terms of educating people to understand the impact of a crisis. What is my usual response to stress?
Yeah.
What is my reaction?
It's the role of training institutions, teaching institutions, learning institutions like our own in this.
Yeah.
think we have a function in that?
We certainly do. And very, very early on in the pandemic, we introduced psychological first aid training to our youth work students. We trained them in understanding crisis and various models of responding to crisis, you know, and embedded in that. So I think, yes, there is an opportunity for us as an institution to be at the fore of that in terms of ensuring that you know, that we support the training of those across the professions to embed protocols that are drawn from, you know, the psychological first aid, the critical incident stress debriefing, the critical incident stress management, the range of kind of theories and practices, simply because they do offer us a structure. And I've worked a lot in responding to trauma across communities in the aftermath of either, of events. And it's that opportunity for people to feel, so this is a normal reaction I'm having to an abnormal event. And that capacity then for people to recognize that they're, you know, people would say to me, I was attending an event a couple of days ago, and you know, these were first responders, and they were saying, I'm doing okay now, but I'm frightened that a couple of months down the line, I'm going to fall apart. And it's like, well, where's the evidence to support that thought? There isn't evidence right now. So we really need to look at self-care, you know, and some of the things that people have been talking about, you know, like getting out in green spaces. The outdoors have become a massive part of the community recovery. That's how people have thrived and been nourished, going through getting into the outdoors. So those kind of basics, the green prescriptions, the social prescriptions, all of those aspects that are part of recovery, you know, and really sort of reducing the potential then for longer term, you know, presentations in mental health services, I think is the feature. And that's where youth services and the allied professions come into their own. They're part of that entire repertoire of responses, I think.
Breda, thank you very, very much indeed. I think you've really brought us back onto the point of the way in which community and universities and the lives of people in communities are really interdependent. And I think that's been our theme today in relation to COVID, in relation to the recovery from COVID, in relation to learning. We come